Miller Park, Big Blue. On July 14, 1999, at the Miller Park Stadium construction site in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, sustained winds were running between 20 and 21 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 26 to 27 miles per hour. Jeffrey Wisher, 40, was an iron worker. He was riding inside a personnel basket suspended from a separate crane near the partially built stadium, working with two fellow iron workers, William DeGrave, 39, and Jerome Starr, 52. Their job that afternoon was to guide a 400-ton section of the stadium's retractable roof onto its tracks. The lift itself belonged to a Lamson Transi-Lift heavy lift crawler crane on the ground, the largest piece of equipment on site, known by name as Big Blue. Big Blue was preparing to hoist the 10th roof section. The boom of the crane was rated to operate in winds up to 20 miles per hour. The gusts that day were already exceeding that limit. Inside the cab, the crane's operator, Terry Young, radioed in and asked for permission to halt the lift because of the wind. The site manager for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries of America, Masao Nishikawa, instructed him to proceed. The problem was the load itself. Big Blue began lifting the 400-ton roof section into the rising gusts, and the boom buckled almost immediately. The entire crane collapsed forward into the partially constructed stadium. The roof section fell with it. Wisher, DeGrave, and Starr were carried down inside the personnel basket and killed at the scene. Rescue crews reached the wreckage within minutes, and 5 other iron workers on the structure were treated for injuries. Investigators determined that Mitsubishi Heavy Industries of America had calculated the side wind effect on the crane itself, but had failed to calculate the wind load against the suspended roof section. The kingpin on the crane had also been improperly installed and maintained. 3 firms were ultimately fined a combined total of more than $500,000. The widows of Wisher, DeGrave, and Starr settled their lawsuit against Mitsubishi Heavy Industries of America for an undisclosed amount totaling more than $99 million. In 2001, a bronze sculpture called Teamwork by Omri Amrani was installed at Miller Park to honor the 3 iron workers. 303 East 51st Street. On March 15, 2008, in the Turtle Bay neighborhood of Manhattan, a 200-foot Favco luffing jib tower crane stood at a high-rise construction site at 303 East 51st Street. Wayne Blydner, 51, was the crane's operator. 6 members of the rigging and oiling crew worked with him on the structure that day. Oiler Anthony Mazza, 39, and 4 riggers, Brad Cohen, 54, Clifford Canzona, 45, Santino Galone, 37, and Aaron Stevens, 45. The crew was performing what's called a jumping operation, lifting a heavy steel stabilizing collar that would anchor the crane to the building at the 9th floor level. The manufacturer's instructions called for 8 steel slings to secure the collar during the lift. The crew used 4 polyester slings instead. As the load went up, the overloaded slings failed. The collar fell. It struck and dislodged 2 lower stabilizing collars that had already anchored the crane to the building. With its lateral support stripped away, the 200-foot crane sheared off from the structure and toppled. Blydner, Mazza, Cohen, Canzona, Galone, and Stevens were killed. The falling crane crushed a 4-story brownstone on East 50th Street, killing Odin Torres, a 28-year-old tourist from Hialeah, Florida, who had been staying inside. 24 others were injured. New York Fire Department and emergency crews reached the site within minutes, and more than a dozen surrounding buildings were damaged. OSHA's investigation found that the rigging foreman, William Rapetti, had directed the use of 4 polyester slings instead of the 8 steel slings the manufacturer required, and that the slings hadn't been inspected for prior damage. Rapetti was charged with manslaughter and tried for the deaths, and in 2010, a jury acquitted him. The crane's owner, James Loma of New York Crane and Equipment Corporation, was separately indicted on manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide charges tied to the company's broader practices. Mayor Michael Bloomberg called the collapse the worst construction accident in New York City's recent history, and the city overhauled its tower crane inspection rules in its wake. The collapse was one of 2 fatal New York City crane disasters that year. A second crane, owned by the same company, would topple 10 weeks later on the Upper East Side, killing 2 more. Bellevue Tower 333. On November 16, 2006, in downtown Bellevue, Washington, a 210-foot Liebherr tower crane stood over the Tower 333 office construction site at the southwest corner of Northeast 4th Street and 108th Avenue Northeast. Matthew Ammon, 31, was a Microsoft attorney who had moved to Bellevue that June. He lived in a top-floor apartment of a residential building directly adjacent to the construction site. That evening, the tower crane began to lean. Within seconds, the 210-foot structure tipped off its foundation and fell across the street. The crane's mast cut through the apartment building, slicing into Ammon's top-floor unit. He was killed inside his apartment. 3 nearby buildings were damaged. Bellevue Fire Department and police responded immediately, evacuating residents from the damaged buildings. The Washington State Department of Labor and Industries determined the collapse was caused by catastrophic failure of a custom-designed, non-standard base. The engineered foundation, designed by Seattle-based Magnuson Clemensic Associates, had been rated to withstand only about 1/4 of the pressure that the 210-foot crane actually required. The companies involved later settled the wrongful death lawsuit brought by Ammon's family. The tragedy prompted the Washington State Legislature to pass a crane safety law that was among the strictest in the nation, Elan City Lights. On June 9, 2019, in Old East Dallas, Texas, a severe Texas storm rolled across the area with wind gusts reaching 70 miles per hour. A tower crane stood at a high-rise construction site neighboring the Elan City Lights apartment complex. Kirsten Smith, 29, was a resident of the Elan City Lights community on the outskirts of Deep Ellum. The day before the storm, the crane's operator had left the crane without setting it to weather vane, the freely swinging mode that lets a tower crane rotate with shifting winds. When the storm hit, the locked crane couldn't align with the wind. The slewing brakes held it rigid. The structure toppled and fell across the Elan City Lights building. The mast cut through Smith's unit, and she was killed inside her apartment. 5 other people were sent to the hospital. Dallas Fire Rescue responded as the storm continued. 534 residents were ultimately displaced and told they wouldn't be returning to their apartments. A post-incident inspection of the crane showed the slewing brakes were engaged, confirming the crane had been locked in place rather than left free to weather vane in the storm. At trial in 2023, plaintiffs' attorneys argued that the operator, who had worked more than 80 hours that week, had failed to set the crane to weather vane mode despite forecasts of severe weather days in advance. They also presented evidence of a lapsed crane inspection, rusty bolts, and an OSHA-violating sign mounted on the crane. In April that year, a Dallas County jury returned an $860 million verdict against developer Greystar, ruling it had been negligent in the operation of the rented crane. Mercer Street Google site. On April 27, 2019, at 3:28 in the afternoon in Seattle, Washington, a 278-foot tower crane sat on Mercer Street at a Google office construction site, with wind gusts exceeding 45 miles per hour. Andrew Yoder, 31, was an ironworker assigned to the crane's dismantling crew. Travis Corbett, 33, was the second ironworker on the structure that afternoon. As the two of them worked on the crane mast, more than 50 connecting pins between the tower sections had been removed prematurely, before the upper sections were safely supported for separation. A wind gust struck the weakened structure, and the tower failed at the section the missing pins had been holding together. The crane fell across Mercer Street and its median, landing on 6 cars near the Fairview Avenue intersection. Yoder and Corbett were killed on the crane. Sarah Wong, a 19-year-old Seattle Pacific University student, and Alan Justad, a 71-year-old retired City of Seattle administrator, were killed inside their vehicles below. 4 other people were injured, and the Google building's roof and eastern facade were damaged. Seattle Fire Department reached the scene within minutes and began extracting victims from crushed vehicles. The Washington Department of Labor and Industries determined the collapse was caused by the premature removal of more than 50 pins between the tower crane sections, which had left the tower significantly weakened and susceptible to the 45+ mile per hour wind gust that toppled it. The state cited the contractor and crane companies for safety violations. A King County jury later awarded more than $150 million to the families of those killed and injured. LyondellBasell refinery. On July 18, 2008, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, at the LyondellBasell refinery in southeast Houston, Texas, one of the nation's largest mobile cranes stood 30 stories tall, capable of lifting 1 million pounds. Marion Hubert Odom III, 41, was one of the crane's operators. John D. Henry, 33, was the second operator. Daniel Lee Johnson, 30, and Rocky Dale Strength, 30, were the ironworkers working with the crane that afternoon. All four worked for Deep South Crane and Rigging, based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The crane was set up for a heavy lift inside the refinery complex. The 30-story structure began to fail. It toppled over inside the refinery property. Odom, Henry, Johnson, and Strength were killed at the scene. 7 other workers were injured. Emergency crews on the refinery and from Houston Fire Department responded. 2 of the severely injured were airlifted to Memorial Hermann Texas Medical Center, and the others went by ambulance to nearby facilities. Investigators focused on the giant mobile crane's counterweight system as a likely cause of the failure, and OSHA's investigation examined whether the assembly and load handling had met manufacturer specifications. OSHA cited Deep South Crane and Rigging following its review. Civil litigation by the families followed. Masjid al-Haram. On September 11, 2015, at approximately 10 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, the Masjid al-Haram, the Grand Mosque in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, was filling with worshippers preparing for the Hajj pilgrimage scheduled to begin 11 days later. A powerful storm was moving through the city, with medium to heavy rain and wind gusts reaching roughly 50 to 65 miles per hour at the height of the storm. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims were inside or near the mosque that evening, awaiting evening prayer. A Liebherr LR 11350 crawler crane, one of the largest of its kind in the world, stood at the mosque's expansion site. Its boom reached nearly 620 feet into the air. The boom of the crane hadn't been lowered or otherwise secured for the incoming storm. As wind speeds climbed above the manufacturer's stated operating envelope, the boom began to swing. The massive arm couldn't hold position. The crane's boom crashed down through the ceiling of the Grand Mosque, falling directly onto the courtyard where pilgrims had gathered for evening prayer. 111 people were killed. 394 others were injured. The Saudi Civil Defense Authority and emergency responders worked through the night and into the following days to remove debris, recover bodies, and tend to the wounded. A subsequent report by Liebherr stated that the crane's roughly 190-meter boom hadn't been sufficiently secured by the Saudi bin Laden group to withstand the wind speeds present that day. Use of the crane in winds of 80 to 105 kilometers per hour fell well outside the manufacturer's recommended operating parameters. Saudi authorities concluded the disaster resulted from a combination of human error and high winds. King Salman ibn Abdulaziz Al Saud ordered a halt to the awarding of new contracts to the Saudi bin Laden group following the disaster. The collapse remains the deadliest crane disaster in recorded history. East 91st Street. On May 30th, 2008, in Manhattan's Upper East Side, just before 8 in the morning, a Kodiak tower crane stood at a 34-story construction site at 331 to 333 East 91st Street. Donald Leo, 30, was the crane's operator. He was inside the cab, 14 stories above the street. Ramadan Kurtaj, 27, was a laborer working on the street below. The tower had reached 205 feet, attached to the building at the 9th floor by a supporting turntable assembly. That morning, the crane tilted, rocked, and then sheared off the turntable. The 205-foot structure plunged 200 feet, striking a building and bouncing off several terraces before crashing onto the pavement. Leo was killed in his cab. Kurtaj was killed on the street below. New York City emergency crews reached the site within minutes and began clearing the wreckage. City and federal investigators traced the failure to a defective weld on the crane's turntable, the bearing that allowed the rig to swivel. James Loma, the crane's owner, had allowed the bearing to remain in service even as concerns about its welds had been raised, and the welds failed during operation. After an 11-month trial with 87 witnesses, a Manhattan jury in 2015 found Loma and his 2 related companies negligent and awarded $24 million in punitive damages to each plaintiff. It was the second fatal crane collapse owned by Loma's companies in New York City that year, 10 weeks after the East 51st Street disaster. If you'd like to see more videos like this, subscribe, and tell me what to cover next in the comments.